The revolution is here. A movement of people free to live, work, and choose. We won't tell you what to think. We just demand that you think for yourself. This is Kibbe on Liberty. Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good. So I desperately wanted to talk to you because I figured you could solve my problem. The moral dilemma that those of us that were skeptical of lockdowns from day one or day two or whenever we decided to be who we are, and the demonization we suffered for wanting to kill our grandmothers and everybody else, we've now come full circle where the Attorney General sort of perhaps hypocritically has said that we need to have some understanding for people that have different views on science, and it was kind of funny to see that. But you have very strong opinions about this. Because you were one of the ones that was demonized and marginalized, and you lost friends over this thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. I would say that my opinion, I'm all for forgiveness, and I think, people can be forgiven at any point in time, but if they don't acknowledge their error and there's not any kind of apology, then it's not really forgivable. And what I've also noticed is that a lot of people are sort of pretending that they couldn't have known, and the other trend I'm seeing is that they're justifying their bad treatment of me by saying, well, you aligned yourself with Republicans who are evil, so that was wrong, no matter whether no matter whether you're right about all the harms this would cause.
It was. I mean, we talked about this last time, but how quickly the tribes formed on this was fascinating to me. Even particularly, you could argue that Trump was particularly bad on lockdowns. He's the guy that platformed Fauci. And yet it does seem to automatically be like a progressive conservative thing.
Yeah.
Why? What happened? Is it just politics and we were beating up Trump so it became partisan?
Yeah, I do think it was a lot. I think I call it Trump derangement syndrome, like a lot of people. And I just see, a lot of my friends or former friends and current relatives, they stay relatives no matter what, are on the left, and they still are just obsessed with their hatred of Trump. It's still very much, I'll have discussions with them where we're talking about the harms of lockdowns, which they're now acknowledging, but they're like, well, in the scheme of things, it's not really that big of a problem. The authoritarianism on the right is the bigger problem. I'm like, really? I mean, January 6th was cited to me by my mother the other day. January 6th was, like a little... it was not a good thing, but this wasn't the entire party. Whereas on the Democratic side, you're seeing an entire party that basically embraced authoritarian measures such as forcing people to stay home and not run their businesses and wear a piece of cloth over their face, and most recently get an injection for something that hadn't been around for very long, with, no long-term data on it. To not sort of see that and to say, well, because it's coming from the Democrats, it must be okay. I sort of see that mentality going on a lot, and it's troubling.
I think about this, and I've said this and done this on the show for the last 2 years. I think this is the biggest humanitarian catastrophe in public policy in my lifetime. And I'm comparing that to 20 years in Afghanistan, so it's a pretty high bar to consider how much damage has been done. So there needs to be at least accountability, and I've seen some pro lockdowners, typically smaller voices, just like people on Twitter that said, "Wow, I really got that wrong.
Yeah.
I'm sorry."
Yeah.
But the big guys,
yeah,
the guys that are sort of vested in doubling down on lockdowns, you're sort of locked in that political equilibrium where if they admit they were wrong, they destroy their brand, they destroy their credibility. If they're a politician, politicians can't say that they ever make any mistakes anymore.
Yeah.
But they need to sort of acknowledge it so that we don't do it again.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And because that hasn't happened, I worry that it will. Fauci, for instance, just said the other day, we have to be prepared to bring restrictions back if cases go up. There's been no sort of resound repudiation on that side that this was the wrong approach. And there are more articles coming out. For instance, in the New York Times, there was one today about, I think deaths among young people 25 to 44 were up 40% or something, alcohol-related and drug overdoses.
Yeah.
Starting in 2020, which anyone with common sense would have predicted. I did, and I'm sure you did, and many other people. Of course, they're pretending it was unknowable.
Right.
But these sorts of things, along with, there's a lot of evidence too about the harms that have been done to children. This should be a repudiation of the entire ideology. And instead, I think the conclusion of the article was, we need to teach people to handle stress better.
How about government-imposed stress?
Yeah, exactly.
You could work out an alternative universe where the government didn't do anything insane, and we went through a fairly tough season of a virus. Like I've read data, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I've read epidemiologists who argue that by vaccinating this virus so early, you basically forced it to mutate. So we got 3 viruses instead of 1. I don't know if that's true, but what would happen in a world where the government didn't do anything at all? And I suspect no one would have noticed.
Yeah. Well, we sort of have, we have real world examples like Sweden, where I think Sweden should have done less.
Right.
People cite Sweden. They took a very soft lockdown approach, but they still had, I believe that they closed colleges. They still asked people to socially distance. There's an argument to be made that you actually shouldn't have closed the colleges, and that maybe telling young people, go on with your lives, that's the best way to do this, because it's pretty clear that natural infection is going to be the way out of this.
Yeah.
Although a friend of mine just got censored on Twitter for saying that, so right. Maybe this video will get taken down.
what I always do, and apparently this is a loophole. If you talk about your personal vaccination experience, which I've only done on this show, then you're allowed to speculate about these things. So I'm going to do it just for editorial purposes. Yeah. I got the shot, and then 2 weeks later I got COVID. Yeah. So that's how it worked for me.
So there is actually, I was speaking to this doctor who's excellent. He says that there is negative vaccine efficacy for 2 weeks. That's actually why you're not considered fully vaccinated for 2 weeks following the last dose. Yeah. So you actually have an increased chance. And this isn't some crackpot. He's
sure. Yeah.
I'm not sure if he'd want me to say his name, so I'm not going to. But this is a very highly esteemed doctor at a big university, Ivy League university, and but that's not known. They don't actually make that public. So you may very well have maybe why.
I don't know, but I was promised robust immunity from Fauci, and I got it. Yeah. I just got it the old-fashioned way.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Well, and there's been I think Pfizer released data showing that the vaccine does not reduce infections at all in the 5 to 11 age group, and they're, mandating vaccines for these children where we have no long-term data. Again, it's stunning, really. And there's no humility. That maybe we just don't know. And that's why it should be a personal choice, because we simply can't know long-term effects of something that's been around for like 18 months.
That's what I would have wanted, and I want to get into what the Surgeon General said, because it's very relevant to that. Because suddenly, the lockdowners and the public health officials have discovered that science is a process of discovering things that we don't know anything about, and as a result, over time, your hypothesis about what's true might be proven wrong, and you change directions, and it's iterative and it's humble.
Yeah.
It's not like it's exactly the opposite of Fauci declaring I am the science.
Yeah.
And they've suddenly discovered this 2 years after speaking in absolute terms about what you must do, and then not letting you choose. That's the problem.
Yes, that is the problem. And that's. The government is now, they really haven't learned anything, because they're propagating this idea that social media and other media should be censoring people who have different views on COVID for spreading misinformation. And there's even a whole initiative put together demanding that these companies turn over information about the sources of misinformation, that's individuals, obviously, to the government, which is stunning. So it's the government saying, if you depart from our message and our position on COVID, COVID and COVID-related issues, you're being punished, and you're being silenced. And this is exactly goes to the heart of the First Amendment, which is about free speech and the free exchange of political ideas. It's a stunning disregard for the principles of, that should be foundational to this country.
The timing was fascinating. This was the Surgeon General announced this initiative where he wanted to cooperate with tech companies to come up with a list of bad actors. And it happened exactly at the time when all of these same government officials were starting to acknowledge that things that they said weren't exactly right, and that they had to reiterate everything from masks to vaccine efficacy and everything else. So how do you have at the same time the government saying, I got some things wrong, while they're gonna go back and retroactively hold people that they disagree with accountable and then force companies to do that.
I think you're looking at people who have no intellectual consistency and no moral, no values at all. I mean, they're not, they're completely willing to make these twisted arguments that frankly a lot of people don't, and I don't want to say that people are not smart. A lot of people, and again, I think this goes back to what I was talking about earlier with my friends or relatives who come from the left. They say, well, whatever the Surgeon General says must be right because he's a good guy and he's with Biden and Biden wants this too and Biden's a Democrat.
He wears a uniform and everything.
Yeah, exactly. So they're not really thinking past that. They're just sort of taking at face value what he says without looking at what's going on.
So, and you've been very active on Twitter pointing this out, but the Surgeon General makes this announcement, and I feel like within 48 hours, some very big lockdown skeptics were just disappeared on social media.
Yeah, so a couple of them, Michael Sanger, and the tweet for which he was supposedly suspended permanently, so he's lost his account forever and you can never create a new one, was pretty benign, especially, I mean, he and others have definitely said things that I would say are more controversial. Not that you should absolutely be able to say anything controversial or anything, right. But it was something like all COVID mitigation measures were a fraud. I mean, that's not that controversial. And then Daniel Kotzen, another big Twitter person, was suspended at the same time, only temporarily so far, for saying that the pandemic would end because of everybody getting infected or most people getting infected, not vaccination. Again, like many epidemiologists hold this view. This is not. Right. This is not. So I think this was directly connected to that. And the Biden administration's attempt to implement, to sort of instrumentalize social media platforms to censor people with divergent views on COVID actually goes back much earlier. The first that I'm aware of was Jennifer Psaki making the White House press secretary making statements about how the tech companies needed to do more. They're responsible for American deaths. There were reports that the White House was sort of threatening companies with regulation. We don't know if they were directly threatened or it was, they were just hoping that they would hear this. So it's my opinion that the companies are worried and they started ramping up censorship. And when I've spoken to a lot of people, their accounts started getting censored and, often for things that were not that crazy around that time. So I think that this is directly traceable to the government's action.
Yeah. It seems like I'm calling it political capture instead of regulatory capture, but it seems kind of a chicken and egg thing where, our private companies actively censoring people just to follow the revenue that they get from advertisers, including, by the way, one of the biggest clients is surely the federal government spending money on these things? Or is it fear of the White House saying, we're coming after you if you don't do this? But either way, it's not a private company acting on their own, I don't think.
No, I don't think so either. And the trick is for any lawyer who wants to litigate this is, proving causation. And, it could be difficult because, you may have to prove that these accounts were censored because of the government. And while there's a strong timeline, and I think there's quite a bit of evidence for that, if there's no direct link established, it might be an uphill battle.
Either way, I think and I'm definitely comfortable saying this is a First Amendment violation.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I don't care if it's nominally a private company, but when the president or his spokesperson is saying, you must stop this.
Yeah.
And often with real political motives too, because it happens to be their political opposition that they're stopping as well.
Yeah, and I mean, from a purely First Amendment standpoint, that's true. And then there's case law to support this. And there was a case called Bantam Books versus, I forgot who the other side was, but from about the 60s. And a commission in Rhode Island had been going around to booksellers. It was like a government commission, threatening them if they didn't stop selling pornography. And the government tried to argue, well, this isn't the government. We're just like saying, you might face some penalties if you don't. And the Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional. That violated the First Amendment. And I think that's probably the most similar case to what we're looking at here. Yeah.
But you're not taking this case?
I have some plans to take this case.
Okay. So here's I pulled this down because the Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, he was on Fox News, I guess this past weekend, and he struck a more conciliatory tone, and I've heard other people say this, and I think it's like wildly hypocritical, and it's he's defending how the science evolves and we learn new data, and that means things are different. But then he goes on to say, but what's also really important is that we have the ability to have respectful, thoughtful dialogue with one another. I worry about the temperature rise in our dialogue about people being shut out in terms of their points of view being heard. We need to be able to hear all voices. We need to be able to respect everybody. And this is like a week or two after he created a list.
Yeah.
It's it's sort of like it's kind of like the Red Scare now. Like we're gonna like purge everybody that we're right.
Yeah.
By the way, they were right. We were wrong. And so like is that he's just like talking out of both sides of his mouth, or is he now worried that he and the Biden administration will be held accountable for being like they're the ones that predicted a winter of misery and death, right?
Yeah, that very much could be. I mean, I think certainly people are coming around and seeing the truth, and that's why about a month ago, someday in February, you saw basically everything changed. All these Democratic mayors and governors were dropping mandates like crazy that they just a week ago said were absolutely necessary.
Right.
Mayor Bowser, one day to the next, dropped the vaccine mandate. So, I mean, everybody knows, and I think there's even a memo. I don't know if we have the real memo, but everybody knows that they got terrible. There was some internal polling done, and they were told Americans don't like this. They're done with this. And so I think they know that the tide is turning, and now they're trying to avoid being held accountable. But it's funny, too. This reminded me, I have a friend at Georgetown Law, and she got an email saying they're finally dropping their mask mandate. But please, if somebody's wearing a mask, please be respectful of their personal choice. Like, oh, now we're being respectful of people's personal choices about what to do with their bodies.
I've had random Karens shout at me in the middle of the street where you're not even supposed to wear a mask, or certainly not required to, just freaking out on you. But But now we're going to be be respectful. Well, but that would have been the approach back when.
Yeah, and I do try to be,
But you're still in this point where they've sort of socialized responsibilities so that apparently it is my burden to wear a mask if you're uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that sticks regardless of the law. Like we've now sort of shifted that responsibility so the biggest Karen in America can get on a plane and expect the rest of us to take her responsibility for her. And that's, I don't know how you fix that. That's a mess.
Yeah, that is a mess. And I honestly don't know what to do about it. And I don't know, I have relatives. I have a relative coming to visit next month, and she asked if I was vaccinated. I'm like, what does that have to do with anything?
Right.
Have you not been watching the last 3 months where everybody who's been vaccinated got COVID?
Maybe she's worried that it's because you are vaccinated that you might be more contagious.
Knowing her, I don't think that's what it was. But I think a lot of it too in these sorts of situations it's about, are you part of my tribe, rather than actually, I think in a lot of ways they've actually abandoned the scientific aspect because that's so obviously not.
Well, they've in fairness to them, they've all moved on to blindly worshiping at the feet of the president of Ukraine.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but
yeah, it seems popular.
For the record, every time we do this now, we have to qualify our statements by saying Putin is a thug. He shouldn't have invaded Ukraine, but maybe we shouldn't just blindly accept the government's narrative.
Yeah.
I don't know. Am I crazy?
No, you're not crazy. And I honestly don't. I'm not educated enough about the Ukraine to have a strong opinion, but I do think the trend is funny between the people who were blindly pro, lockdown and COVID hysteria and now just have switched to.
Yeah, that's the dynamic and I don't want to get into Ukraine either, but the dynamic of where a switch was flipped and we were suddenly allowed to talk about the problems with lockdowns and masking and all that stuff. But now those same companies, perhaps directed by the same government officials, are determining what you're allowed to say about the invasion of Ukraine. And I don't.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the infrastructure of government censorship that's sort of now baked into the cake. So I think we should at least notice that we're getting dangerously close to a point where we're not allowed to criticize the government's actions.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter what they are.
Yeah.
Good actions, bad actions.
Did you hear this? Robbie Suave from Reason, his video was taken down where it was some speech that Trump gave, and he was actually criticizing him. They were criticizing him in the video, but apparently they didn't criticize him quickly enough, or it wasn't clear enough, so they took it down. So, I mean, and whatever you think of Trump, which I certainly don't think well of him, but he was the president of the United States for 4 years. Like, to act like we can't even have a video of him and talk about it, I mean, this is scary stuff.
Yeah, it's insane. You mentioned the memo. And I dug around. There's supposedly a memo done by the president's polling company. I think it's the one you're talking about. Yeah. And I did some digging to see if it was real because it seemed like a parody, but I think it was real. Yeah. But whether or not it was real, I immediately saw spokespeople for the Democrats on TV saying exactly the messages that they decided. So. The science didn't change, just the midterms are coming.
Exactly.
That's all that happened.
There was a memo I saw. It was from like a focus group or something, but it was to the Democratic politicians. I think it was probably not the real version that they all got. But it's also like, the message is declare victory. We, the Democrats, have beaten COVID. Yeah. Because Democratic politicians can beat COVID, a virus. And, it's time to declare victory and move on. But of course, there's still no acknowledgement or repudiation of what went on, and I think that's important. Otherwise, it will just happen again.
Yeah, the infrastructure is there, not just for censorship, but I think that the precedent now is that lockdown is the right. Fauci said it just a couple days ago. Yeah. Like, we may have to do this again. Yeah. So there's no learning. There's no and I don't know how you reconcile if they won't take accountability for what they did.
Yeah. I don't either. I guess that's what I use my Twitter account for. But,
you're going to litigate this on Twitter.
I want to make sure people don't forget the next time around.
Yeah. Have you named names? Like, some of the big guys, I don't even know these guys, but maybe my brain's better off that I don't know them.
Oh, like the scientists on Twitter?
Yeah,
there's Greg Gonsalves and Jeremy Faust. They've both blocked me, so I don't know. And I don't like harass people, but I'll say this is very flawed reasoning. And then I have a whole contingent of crazy lefty, they're all men for some reason, but who just keep going after me for working for Koch-funded people. And that's all they have. I work for Koch-funded people. I've only worked for 501c3s, so it's like they're not even connecting it to me getting some huge windfall.
By the way, it's still the Koch brothers, even though there's
only one.
There's only one. Yeah. But that's whenever they sort of lose all the arguments, that's their thing. Right?
Yeah. And there's just a complete lack of logical thinking there, because it's like, well, I mean, first of all, I've aligned myself with certain people because I care very much about this and I want to fight it, and these are the people who are fighting it. It doesn't necessarily mean I agree with them on everything. But also, if you're accusing me of having some nefarious motives or being corrupt, I mean, then you have to show I'm getting something out of it that's like out of the ordinary.
I don't feel like being opposed to lockdowns from day one was a particularly lucrative position to be in.
No, it was the opposite.
Yeah. Everybody leaves you like you're a leper or something.
Yeah. And I've certainly limited my employment prospects for the future by taking this position. I mean, I can't. I no left-leaning organization, or even libertarian left organization will hire me. I might be too much for even big law firms, Yeah. So I, if anything, not benefited.
Welcome to the unlucrative world of hopefully being principled.
Yeah.
But, so I want to ask you the final question, the totally changing gears, but I saw you had, and I'm going to read her name, which is why I'm looking at my phone, Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Yeah.
Did I say that right?
Yeah.
You had, I'll characterize your take as, of the possible choices, she's actually pretty strong on some civil liberties type issues, so she's probably the best we're going to get from the Democrats.
Yeah, and I may have been too optimistic about her. I mean, there are a lot of things that are not great. She certainly doesn't show much skepticism of agency power, although she hasn't. She has actually enjoined agency action on a couple of occasions and found that their interpretation of statutes, their powers under statutes, was too broad. But, I was really thinking we could end up with someone terrible, and I was worried about like another Sotomayor who's just, you know,
Right.
completely ideological, unable to follow the law at all, and just very results oriented in terms of reaching whatever the progressive left result is. And I think there's some hope here that she's not totally like that.
So, like, you're not the only one that said this. Justin Amash tweeted out a couple days ago that I won't quote him because I'll get it wrong, but he's basically like, she's a heck of a lot better than Merrick Garland.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess you have to, and then, you probably know Ilya Shapiro got in trouble for a dumb tweet that
poorly phrased
a dumb tweet that you would have to read with ill will to think that
exactly.
he was making a racial statement.
Exactly.
But he argued that somebody else would have been better than her. But I just wonder, you as a lawyer that works on constitutional stuff, what your general take is on her.
Yeah, I mean, sort of what I said. I mean, she's not unwilling to enjoin agencies. She doesn't seem to think, we should never do anything to rein in agencies. But she's certainly not, Gorsuch or someone like that.
Yeah.
I also have to admit, as a former public defender, she was also a public defender, and they're underrepresented on the bench. A lot of heavily leans towards people who are prosecutors. So I think that can, give a certain favors one sort of viewpoint. And public defenders do tend to have skepticism of the government, although I've seen a lot of people not carry that over to the COVID stuff.
No, I think, and our friend at Cato's made an argument about that always having prosecutors creates a bias.
Yeah.
In the decision making.
For sure. And she that was another thing I liked about her. She had worked with Cato on something. I forgot exactly what it was, but it shows that she's not one of these people who's unwilling to work with the right or whatever because they're evil. And so, and I have a couple of colleagues who've appeared before her and said she's active and engaged, and she's intelligent. She's clearly knows her stuff, which better than a lot of people.
Now I know slightly more than nothing about her, and I haven't paid attention to it yet. It's going on right now, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I suspect she'll get confirmed, but we'll see.
So, how do people find your work, and if you have any cool stuff coming up, let us know about it. I
will for sure. I'm Lefty Lockdowns 1 on Twitter as my handle. And I work at the new Civil Liberties Alliance, so all my cases and cases that I will soon be filing will be available on their website. It's ncalegal.org.
Okay, I know you got something cool, and maybe you come back and tell us about that once you crush the man.
Sounds great.
Okay,
thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that show, make sure that you like and subscribe. Click the little bell so that you get notifications. And if you consume this via podcast, go wherever you want to go. We're everywhere. Kibbe on Liberty. The revolution starts now.